The Brooklyn Camorra or New York Camorra was a loose grouping of early 20th century organized crime groups that formed among Italian immigrants originating in Naples and the surrounding Campania region living in Greater New York, particularly in Brooklyn. In the early 20th century, the criminal underworld of New York City consisted largely of Italian Harlem-based Sicilians and groups of Neapolitans from Brooklyn, sometimes referred to as the Brooklyn Camorra, as Neapolitan organized crime is referred to as the Camorra. Background: the substantial population of the New York Italian immigrant community offered plentiful economic opportunities. At the turn of the century, some 500,000 Italians, mainly originating from the impoverished southern regions of Italy, lived in New York City and had to survive in difficult social and economic circumstances. A New York Times article in 1885 mentions the presence of the Camorra in New York, involved in extortion and immigrant and labor racketeering. Italian immigration made fortunes for speculators and landlords, but it also transformed the neighborhood into a kind of human ant heap in which suffering, crime, ignorance and filth were the dominant elements, according to historian Arrigo Petacco. According to sociologist Humbert S. Nelli, New York's Italian community offered a lucrative market for illicit activities, particularly gambling and prostitution. It also provided a huge market for products from the homeland and from the West Coast, such as artichokes and olive oil, the distribution of which the criminal elements attempted to control. Early crime bosses. The cheap labor needed for the expansion of capitalism of that time was made available by the scores of poor Italian immigrants. Like earlier immigrant generations, a few Sicilians and Neapolitans engaged in criminal activities to succeed, employing the crime traditions from their original Italian home regions. One of the prominent crime bosses was Enrico Alfano, who became one of the principal underworld targets of Police Sergeant Joseph Petrosino, the head of the Italian squad of the New York City Police Department. Another prominent criminal boss around 1910-15 was Joe Sugolucci, the undisputed king of Little Italy born in Naples, who employed Neapolitan and Sicilian street gangs as his enforcers for the Italian lottery or numbers game and enjoyed functional immunity from law enforcement through his political contacts. Apart from them, there were different Camorra gangs in New York. The gangs had their roots in the Neapolitan Camorra, but most members were American-born. The two New York-based Camorra groups were the Neapolitan Navy Street Gang headed by Alessandro Valero and Leopoldo Loretano, and the Neapolitan Coney Island Gang under the command of Pellegrino Marano, who ran his activities from his Sugolucci restaurant in Coney Island. Valero and Loretano owned a coffee house at 133 Navy Street in Brooklyn. The coffee house was used as the headquarters for their gang, which mainly consisted of Neapolitans, and was often referred to as the Camorra. Marano opened the Sugolucci restaurant close to the Coney Island amusement parks with his right-hand man Tony Paretti, from where his gang made money in gambling and cocaine dealing. The gangs were not tightly led organizations, but rather loose associations where everybody worked for himself, although Marano was one of the leaders that initiated recruits as Camorristi. Both gangs initially worked together against the Murillo crime family from Italian Harlem for control of the New York rackets. The Camorra groups tried to muscle in the lucrative artichoke business, but the wholesale dealers resisted their threats. In the end, a deal was negotiated in which a tax of $25 was levied on every carload of artichokes delivered, under threat of stealing the dealers' horses or wrecking their merchandise. Coal and ice merchants also proved hard to extort, and the business gains of the groups were not as large as they expected. Eventually, they were decimated when their own members turned against them. Mafia Kimura War. The fight over the control of the New York rackets is known as the Mafia Kimura War and started after the killing of Joe Sugolucci and his son on May 17, 1915. The violence and string of murders prompted a reaction from the authorities. Police convinced Ralph Daniello to testify against his former associates of the Brooklyn Navy Street Gang. He provided evidence about 23 murders, Several grand juries issued 21 indictments in November 1917. At the trials, some criminals involved depicted the Navy Street and Coney Island gangs as Camorra and used Mafia to identify the groups from East Harlem. The trials in 1918 entirely dismantled the Navy Street gang. Testimonies of their own associates destroyed the internal protection against law enforcement they once enjoyed. The demise of the gangs meant the end of the Camorra in New York and the rise in power of their rivals, the American-based Sicilian Mafia groups. Following the downfall of the New York Camorra, Neapolitan or Campanian organized crime groups in New York were absorbed into or merged with the newly dominant Sicilian Mafia groups in New York, creating the modern Italian-American Mafia, which would increasingly consist of not only Sicilians but Italian and Italian-American criminals from various Italian regions. Future Italian-American gangsters that originated from Naples or Campania, like Vito Genovese, operated in Italian-American mafia families, in which an Italian-American gangster's exact Italian region of origin had little importance as long as he was of Italian origin. References. Sources: Obodinsky, Howard, 2010. Organized Crime, 9th edition, Belmont, C.A., Wadsworth, ISBN 978-0-495-59966-1. Critchley, David, 2009. The Origin of Organized Crime in America, The New York City Mafia, 1891-1931, New York, Routledge, ISBN 0-415-99030-0. Mike, 2009. The First Family, Terror, Extortion, Revenge, Murder, and the Birth of the American Mafia, New York, Random House, ISBN 978-1400067220. Nelly, Humbert S. 1981. The Business of Crime. Italians and Syndicate Crime in the United States, Chicago, The University of Chicago Press. ISBN 0-226-57132-7, originally published in 1976. Romano, Ann T. 2010. Italian Americans in Law Enforcement, Zlibris Corporation, ISBN 978-14535-58812.